Very excited now to introduce our next speaker, Charles Jencks, who divides his time between lecturing, writing, and designing in the US, the UK, and all over Europe. He's the author of many, many books. It's an incredibly long list. I'm going to just quote a few. The Language of Postmodern Architecture, which was reissued as the new paradigm in architecture. What is Postmodernism? The Architecture of the Jumping Universe, as well as the Iconic Building, or The Power of Enigma. He's also built a celebrated garden in Scotland, which he also made into a book, The Garden of Cosmic Speculation, and very important inspiration for the Manifesto Marathon here. He's compiled an extraordinary book of architecture manifesto. A very warm welcome to Charles Jencks. I must also say that Charles is the oldest friend of Frank Gehry in the UK, was the first person to write on Frank Gehry in the UK. A very warm welcome to Charles Jencks.
Thank you very much, Hans. Thank you for inviting me, you and Julia. They're very kind. I'm delighted to be here to speak on manifestos, skeptical as I am about manifestos. And I suppose you've been 2 days shivering in the cold listening to people give their manifestos. I think everybody must hate manifestos by now. It's a very dangerous genre, going back, of course, to Imhotep, the first architect, and his pharaoh, Zoser, who wrote a manifesto, and coming through Moses and God and other people. Why am I skeptical about manifestos today? Well, because we're in an era of skepticism with no grand meta-narratives, as the French like to describe it, Jean-François Lyotard, the end of grand manifestos, grand narratives. And if you don't have a narrative, if you don't have a view of the universe, then how can you write a manifesto today, which isn't deeply ironic? That's a question. Partly, I'm worried about them because they often sound like political posturing, like Gordon Brown on a bad day, or even a good day. In other words, it sounds like a manifesto from the Labour Party or the SNP, Scotland, where I lived sometime, or David Cameron. In other words, manifestos have been killed by politics, although you've probably just been listening to art manifestos. Usually politics take it over. Remember Gordon Brown 2 years ago came out with a manifesto in favor of Britishness. We were all British. Even as an American, I'm British, you're British. Can you remember that manifesto of Britishness? How he hoped it would turn the corner. So manifestos end up, I think, in our age of incredulity towards grand meta-narratives, they end up as a form of self-parody. They're embarrassing. We blush to give them, and everybody hates a manifesto. That's my start. They have, above all, a problem of tone. What tone do you address an audience in with a manifesto? With an agenda tone, like a politician? Well, obviously, a manifesto has to be pithy, short, declarative, performative. It has to be obvious and repetitive. Again and again and again and again, repetitive. And how do you say all that without being boring and predictive? So the first problem really is one of tone. And that's why today, this afternoon, I'm talking about manifestos squared, manifestos to the second power, a manifesto which I think today must be ironic. It must acknowledge certain things of the past. Think of the three most important manifestos in the West. First of all, that of the Jews, and God's manifesto, the Bible, the Old and New Testaments. Or the manifesto given to Moses when he comes down with the tablets of the Ten Commandments. God speaking. If you don't believe that God speaks directly through the Bible, you might believe it speaks through the J source when the Jews were in captivity and trying to get out from underneath the Babylonians. Well, this was an incredibly important manifesto, and you could say a foundation manifesto for the West. Or maybe the second most important one by Karl Marx, beautifully written, 1847, the Communist Manifesto, or if you're an architect, 1923, Le Corbusier, toward a new architecture, Esprit Nouveau. Three of the great manifestos. They all had the misfortune of becoming true, which is another reason we all hate them and are suspicious. Think of, Israel, the promised land. Think what it is today for the Israelites or the Palestinians. Think of what communism became for Karl Marx. Think what modern architecture, l'Esprit Nouveau, became for Le Corbusier. As I say, may you be condemned to have your come true. An architect, writer in the 19th century, John Ruskin, of course, prophesied and polemicized and wrote manifestos, The Stones of Venice, and he lived to see his manifesto come true, and he all over London, and he hung his head. Venetian Gothic revival. He was very upset. And Nietzsche, who wrote one of the great manifestos of the 19th century, also Sprach Zarathustra, Thus Spake Zarathustra, predicted that it would be misinterpreted, as indeed it was by Hitler. So you can see immediately that the manifesto as a genre is 4,000 years old at least, and highly in danger of coming true. There's a last reason to be suspicious, and that is since the 60s, artists, since the neo-avant-garde, since Andy Warhol wrote To A and B and Back Again, the manifesto has become indistinguishable from marketing and lost its disinterested prophetic role as it's become a kind of art manifesto to put one on the map. Damien Hirst famously said in the year 2000, carrying forward the Warholian advertisement, he said, an artist? I'm first a brand name. So manifesto is, if you think of a poor starving artist, like Damien Hirst used to be, it was the easiest way to get your message out on the street. In any case, given that background, I think that a manifesto today has to be self-reflexive, it has to be self-critical, it has to warn against its own message, and it has to be, above all, a multiply voiced discourse and ironic. It has to criticize its own assumptions. So I start with this picture of a depressed man 5 days ago on the front page of the Financial Times. You probably can recognize him. I ask you to bear his facial muscles in mind as you listen to my manifesto on the critical modernism. His grimace, his bald-headed grimace, is reacting to his own catastrophic interaction with the economy. Remember what Hank Paulson did 2 or 3 weeks ago when he bought out Fannie Mae. As Anatole Koletsky has written many times since then, it started the stampede. It started the world credit crunch. By buying out Fannie Mae, by intervening, he told all the investors in the stock market that their investments were worthless. They better get out now. And of course, there was a worldwide panic. To save Fannie Mae, he started the credit crunch. And then, as if to prove how stupid he was, and Koletsky has called him the smartest economist since Rumsfeld was the smartest general in Iraq, he let the Lehman Bank, go to the wall, thus doubling the problem. So you could say the credit crunch, and that's what Koletsky and economists are now understanding, the credit crunch has been brought on by his own manifesto. So ours is the high day of global warning. There's warnings out there. Everybody's warning. 2 years ago, everybody but Gordon Brown knew about the impending credit crunch. He might, that is, Gordon Brown might have listened to Warren Buffett, who announced it in 2003. Warnings have now intensified into screams. Global warming has been drowned out by crashing banks. Thus, the manifesto demands to be written and to be heard. The Manifesto Squared, which asserts the basic truths of the time, but with critical irony. Critical irony, critical modernism, a prefix critical, a suffix modernism. What is the hidden truth of our time? That everybody is a modernist. Even Prince Charles is a modernist, and especially those fundamentalists who deny it. Why? First, as sociologists have long observed, because fundamentalism is a typical form of modernism. Second, because anti-modernists are just as much drawn into the global network as anyone else. Their laptops and cell phones are proof. Their Nike terrorism is a sign of globalization. This is an Iraqi jihad against a burnt-out American piece of technology. A man is dancing with his Nike shoes, his pullovers, his 20th century costume, and his scarf on the wreckage. These fundamentalists take on the logic of their system they dispute, the one that is pervasive as the credit crunch. The philosopher John Gray showed in 2002 in his book Al-Qaeda and What It Means to Be Modern that the assumptions of Osama bin Laden and the fundamentalists stem from modernity. Those who go to war end up sharing the means and ends of the enemy. Everybody is a modernist. Modernism, modernity, modernization. The three M's come together as a tight network. They cover the globe and leave little room for escape. The modern world, compelled forward by the imperative of continuous economic growth, is a juggernaut with no reverse gear. Every obstacle put in its path, from the Club of Rome report on the limits of growth in 1972 to the Brundtland report 1987 to the Rio Earth Summit of 1992 and the Kyoto Protocol of 1995, all of these are rolled over without a bump in the road, in spite of the unmistakable signs of Greenland glaciers sliding into the sea. The juggernaut accelerates, celebrating the prospects of the new, the melting lands of the Arctic Circle, which you see here. The Arctic is thawing. What an opportunity. Russia, Canada, America, go for it. Here is virgin territory, not entirely owned, full of minerals waiting to be exploited. New gas and oil fields, the largest in the world. In the Barents Sea, new shipping lanes to make a fortune, new virgin fishing stocks waiting for the high-tech nets, even new tourist sites under construction. Tourist hotels are now springing up on these melting coasts. In 20 years, the Arctic Passage will be the new Gulf. Goodbye, Dubai. Global warming? Why worry? Go north. If everybody is a modernist, the question becomes, what kind? If the suffix is agreed, what's the prefix? Cynical? Modernist? It is true that skepticism grows and grows like a runaway panic. It swells online, and today that means it is increasing at the speed of the web. In the 60s, the young were skeptical because of the lies about Vietnam. Today, top of Bush's indefatigable fibs about Iraq are the lies about American deaths. This is a slide from the web which shows the first 1,000 American soldiers killed. It's made up of their portrait to make his portrait, because their deaths were not acknowledged by the American government. Their personal deaths. Britain is no better. According to YouGov polls and other polls of February 2007, 16% of the British people believed Prime Minister Blair was not telling the truth, which means that 84% thought he was a fraudster. According to the YouGov poll, 50% of the people felt that Britain had gotten worse over the last year of 2006, and the country would still be a worse place to live in 5 years, and that's even before the credit crunch. The verdict: widespread disenchantment, private wealth and public squalor, growing skepticism. By 2007, 84% of the British accepted their leader as Tony Blair, that blind was common, the cash for honors was the norm. That was accepted as the norm in Britain. As the Russians know, skepticism grows directly in proportion to lying. And of course, the biggest lie was the culture of fear, engendered first by 2001, September 11th, and then by the Islamic attack on 7/7. Everybody is a modernist, and most are lying. The choice is clear: become cynical or critical. Jeremy Paxman, who you see in the middle right, with Noam Chomsky to his left and Simon Jenkins to his right, one of the three dogs of Cerberus with their waggy critical tail. And on the left, on your left, are the women critics with Hannah Arendt, the upper left, and Jane Jacobs, and Aung San Suu Kyi, and Anna Politkovskaya, and Rachel Carson. All of them critics, laughing at apparently a sinking Leviathan with the Burj Dubai in his hand. Or, and this is a question, is he really rising? In any case, Jeremy Paxman, skeptic of Newsnight, cross-examines the man who put in the Whittington pit for the London Olympics. As you know, Britain won the Olympics. Was it not strange, angry, and ironic, Paxman intones, that this bid was economical with the truth, that the estimate sprawled from £3 billion to £6 billion and then to $9 billion, and all the lying was done knowingly? Well, came the explanation offered up as the final word. We won, didn't we? We won at $3 billion, even if it's $9 billion. That is the attitude of government committed to blind. It makes the arts pay for the bread and circuses and expensive architecture. John Tulsa and those dependent on art grants were not amused. Lies about Iraq are only the most public form of deceit. When 84% of a country believes its prime minister is loosely connected to the truth, then skepticism becomes the habit of mind, the reigning style. Such moods change art and architecture. Since Look Back in Anger and the Angry Young Men of the 1950s, since Francis Bacon's characters writhed in cages and brutalism dominated the housing scene, more recently, since Martin Amis and Damien Hirst, the art of anger has become a primary facial expression. With Brit art, it is as common as in the 19th century novel, the blush was on the Virgin's cheek. The implications are clear for critical modernism. If chronic problems with modernization can be assumed, and if anger becomes the background mood, then the critical will not be the choleric. Sustainability? Well, 24 hours fury is not an option. The new style would not be rage, but the classical frigid air, the angry serene, the angry serene. How do we know this? Look at the public face of the typical celebrity today. Look at the head-butting Zidane on your right, turning into Herzog, the architect, and then into Rem Koolhaas, all indistinguishable with their expression. You see what I mean when I say it's as conventional as the blush on the Virgin in the 19th century. What do they have in common? The professional inability to say cheese. Look at the sullen face of Damien in all his branding photographs. As conventional as the scowl on the brands of the art, Damien Hirst adopts the angry serene in his best work. For instance, his crucifixions of nature, the flayed sheep on the cross, a comment on a previous anger, that of Francis Bacon's triptych. The rage of Achilles, the wrath of Zeus, the fury of Medusa, the rants of Hamlet, all too histrionic. Today, the American artist Brian Tolley is ultra cool in his depictions of a country divided into the blue and red states. This was done after the last election. Very interesting. It was based on Join or Die of Benjamin Franklin. Join or Die, and it's a snake, a two-headed snake, which actually exists in nature. It's a sport. And it was because of Franklin's interest in electricity. This snake came together with a bang with its magnetic, when the electricity came through those lines, and the heads vibrated. Angry, serene, classical, frigid air. Simmer and boil and don't lose your cool. Berlin is a city where critical modernism has developed the most, because there modernism has destroyed the most. The Chinese artist Chai Guo-Chang is invited to comment on this history. He creates a composed response to the terrors of modernity. 99 ravenous wolves jump across the space, the ultimate image of herd mentality, and hit the glass wall. He uses gunpowder, you see in the upper left, to create these controlled, cool explosions, channeling the angst into the blast. As if to underline the composure of the rest, Chai gathers a crowd of well-heeled art onlookers into a gallery courtyard. He places stencils of wolves on a huge canvas, sets off a controlled blast, then displays the blackened silhouettes as if they were artworks lifted from Lascaux. You see at the bottom there, the stencils created in the explosion, creating the art. They are raw and primitive, but like photographs, distanced and unruffled. The angry serene gets its charge by presenting nastiness with tranquil professionalism. Renaissance sprezzatura is emulated, making the difficult look easy. So it goes in Berlin, a city built on catastrophe and dragging a critical art from it. There are the monuments to war and occupation, the two prominent Holocaust memorials by Daniel Libeskind and Peter Eisenman, and the paintings and sculpture of Anselm Kiefer. These take on such events as a departure point for something moving, aesthetic, and symbolic. The Germans have debated their past, their recent past, the 20th century modernist past, in the Bundestag, and allowed the unwelcome facts of recent history to be remembered and turned into a descriptive and indexical art. Right in the heart of their parliament, dedicated to the Volk, are Russian graffiti preserved behind glass. These curse the Nazis, and they curse the German Volk. And their preservation in the Bundestag shows that denial and lying are not always dominating public discourse. In many corners of the city, a style of acknowledging the modern past is emerging, displaying the facts without rhetoric. Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which you see here, is characteristic. Abstract, descriptive, and neutral, it calls on the ubiquitous white cube of 1920s modernism. But in Berlin, to symbolize the dead, the cubes are gray, and of course shaped like graves. That makes the modern cliche of the white cube into the ironic, iconic, something semantic. Gives it a spiritual role more than its meaning, which it had in the modern period as the aesthetic of emptiness. The critical approach stems as much from the complexities of contemporary life as it does the calamities. Hence, the canonic works of critical modernism include the complex buildings that have emerged through algorithmic design. To see what is at stake, take the building closest to home, which isn't here today, Ito Toyo Ito and Cecil Bauman's 2002 Serpentine Pavilion. It's the perfect counterpart to Mies van der Rohe's modernist pavilion of 1929. It's the perfect thermometer to gauge the present, to see the difference between old modernism and its critical grandson. Ito and Bauman shows the new fractal geometry of nature, forms that mirror the processes of the cosmos, generated by an algorithm of an expanding and rotating square, which you can see rotating from the center here through the sides and the ceiling. This very simple formula is allowed to create a very complex geometry in plan, elevation, section, and detail. Just as the simple formula of the Mandelbrot set, z equals z squared plus c, creates the most uniform form of variety, a symbol of nature, complexity. The complexity of nature framed in this building. So does the rotating square. Today, computer production makes the generation of complex artifacts suddenly much cheaper. For buildings and complex artworks, it allows us to mix algorithms and to cross-code them with nature. The computer is our microscope and TV screen on the world. It allows us to see the universe unfold, to follow a single cell splitting in two, to celebrate the emergence of nature in real time. And so for a garden, I have used the computer and the story of the universe and the major units of the universe, the black holes, DNA, unfolding elements, and used as a language and iconography, and told the story in this universe cascade you see here, to see the universe unfolding over its 13.7 billion years to the present at the top. This new story leads to a new understanding of time. It's, of course, a metaphor, if there ever was one. A new relation to the rest of everything that places the evolution of culture within a critical space. It is skeptical of both old modern metaphors based on the pentagon, that is, the selfish gene, typical pentagon metaphor, the Big Bang, even more typical maybe of the pentagon, and what physicists tell us are the ultimate particles underlying everything, either wimps or machos. Think of those metaphors, selfish gene, Big Bang, wimps or machos, and you get a very clear idea about old modernism. So the present worldview is cosmogenic and sees parts of the universe in a process of growth and death as a continuous creative unfolding event, which we're still very much involved. Cosmogenesis gives the larger picture, frames the perspective against which local events occur, gives a cosmic and comic distance, one that allows a critical temperament to develop. But, of course, the critical is not the creative. It is on the wrong side of the brain. You cannot inspire action with a critical temperament. Skepticism does not persuade people to be creative any more than an angry architect persuades a client to build something interesting, not even a serenely angry architect. So the critical outlook, inevitable in our time, needs a complementary force, an oppositional character, something completely different, and that is supplied, you won't be surprised to hear, by our global condition of modernism. Everybody is a modernist, even Prince Charles and Osama bin Laden. Modernism over the last 200 years has grown from the Romantic Rebellion. Modernism is dynamic, progressivist, anarchic, forward-looking, obsessed by change, adolescent, in love with the new, forgetful, amnesiacal, lacking perspective, Chinese, oily, heading for the melting Arctic, and now located somewhere off the coast of Dubai. Modernization is unstoppable, destructive of culture, competitive, and usually surprising. A breath of fresh and foul air. Modernity is now the global condition, but modernism, the suffix of our time, is not enough. Madam Modernism desires her opposite. She yearns for a good prefix, the critical. So, with the laughing modernists, critical modernists in front of you, remember, critical modernism is many things. It welcomes global growth while taxing carbon. The Stern Report plus the Nordhaus critique. A good martini with critical amounts of vermouth plus potent gin. It is romantic love minus illusions. Critical modernism is a sound of one hand clapping and the other waving. Critical modernism, as Rem said, is a tautology turned into an oxymoron. Critical modernism is a skeptical mood tempered by hope. Critical modernism is the joyful science that turns disgust into laughter. Thank you.